on the UK is apparently the most geographically unbalanced economy in Europe. And as we've been at the Jubilee Centre doing some research, relational thinking, I really think there are so many profound ideas, already policies, practices, research done. So I don't think I can contribute much towards what policies are needed. But what I would like to do is to bring in maybe more African perspective or more African examples to also just inform the discussion. And also to show that actually it's a different context, but there are similar trends in African society. It's very broadly, obviously, but there's contextual differences as well. And although this is from my academic research, I really hope it will also have many practical implications as well. So what I would like to start with is first also, and that also comes from, it was similar yesterday, being more critical about this idea of GDP growth policies. Because GDP growth policies do not inherently contribute to human development, and I would argue is even incompatible with creating strong relationships. And it does not consider the levels of complexity with which issues must be addressed, and I want to use again African examples to illustrate this. And there must be a much larger wave of policymakers, officials, business leaders, communities, families, moving away from this focus on growth if we want to see policies that create strong relationships. And when I was thinking about policies to create strong relationships, I thought the Royal Bafokeng Nation in South Africa is the perfect example of right policies that lead to stronger and better relationships within a community. So this community is known as one of Africa's success stories because it owns the land and receives the royalties coming from mining businesses on their land. So I thought, well, this is good. But when I did further research, it actually revealed that although it's perceived as this phenomenal success because it has this ability to generate enormous profits for the community, it fails to account, or it fails to achieve transparency and accountability. So as a result, the equitable distribution of the community wealth does not occur, and it deepens inequality within the community. So this focus on growth and profit is, especially for the Bafokeng King and its administrators, do not benefit the community. So the mining doesn't benefit the community because the administrators are still focused on this growth and profit. And so the wealth that is supposed to belong to the community does not trickle down to the community. And so I still think it's this focus on growth, on profit, and not on the well-being of that community, which is the biggest problem. And we also see these worrying contradictions all over Africa. We see roaring growth on the one hand, and on the other hand, we see rising poverty, inequality, and unemployment. So, for example, in Botswana, which is Africa's success story, it has one of the world's highest economic growth since independence. So it has had a 9% GDP growth rate since 1966 to 1999. Yet, over 20% of the population is still poor. And many African countries are unstable, yet the growth figures seem really good. It's normally between 4, 5, 6, 7%. In South Africa, for example, despite the 3% average since 1994 of growth rate, in 1994, South Africa's official unemployment rate was 20%. Today, it's 27.7%. The distribution of income is now more unequal than it was in 1994, and 55.5% of South Africans are poor. So South Africa's structural inequalities are still intact, and the systemic challenges in society persist, while the focus on growth and income inequality fails to take into account the complexity of inequality and the much deeper levels at which it must be addressed. So we need an entirely new development model based on relationships and the well-being of people. Yet many hold onto this growth mantra with sufficient evidence that shows its negative impact on human rights, and especially second-generation economic rights, and by extension it increases social instability. And when I consider this complexity, I Googled, just for interest's sake, policies to create strong relationships. And the first website that came up said or suggested that we should increase minimum wages as progressive policy for strong relationships. But I think even this it requires more depth and understanding. And again, I'll use an African example. So in an upcoming chapter, a Kenyan guy, Jason Mushioka, argues that this notion of a rising middle class in Africa, which is largely in urban settings, and this 4.3% continental average growth rate in Africa, so you have those which obviously should lead to this increasing wages, which should lead to this increasing middle class, but actually the African middle class caught between poor past generations and a future generation which requires economic support. So this African middle class are entangled within much more complex relationships of poorer relatives and their linkages, which makes it harder to invest and consume as the middle class than your growth enthusiasts would, I would believe. In fact, retailers across Africa are closing shop largely because the market is insufficient to sell their products. In South Africa, these entanglements where this middle class support their families are also known by some as black tax. And I found, for example, that my own parents probably had a more individualistic approach, where they supported me until I reached independence. And in turn, I earned my own money, and so I could spend it on investments or whatever I can now, and they continue with their own. So it's sort of, we interact, but we have our own. But what I found with many of my black friends was they were actually more entangled within much more complex relationships, in the sense that those who became accountants or doctors, first of all, had to pay for their own studies, which I didn't have that much pressure. And then once they got the job as the doctor or the accountant, they immediately became the breadwinner, so they had to support a very big family. And so for them, investments, cars, houses simply had to wait. So even though my friends may have received higher salary than I did, I realized that the reality of a new rising black middle class was much more complex than I thought. So this excessive focus on economic growth, income, increasing wages, productivity, competition, profit, contradict models and movements focused on collaboration, care, and embracing the complexities of relationships, which is embedded within much deeper socio-economic context. And again, this black tax, for example, it is very relational, and again, as Mushioka argues, even though it is part of the informal economy, and sometimes the informal economy is almost disregarded, black tax is essential in redistribution of wealth and helping families from sinking into deeper levels of poverty in South Africa. So we need new terrains of thinking about the economy, and while doing my research, I realized that, or what comes out is that GDP growth on the one hand is not working well, and more people are acknowledging that, but on the other hand, you have your new Marxists, and they understand the systemic and the structural problem very well, but they don't provide viable policies and solutions to the problems. So finding alternative solutions, what I did find was more and more moving towards alternatives, and one of this is also called the human economy. And this is an emerging paradigm which argues for more detailed study and consideration of alternative socio-economic ideas to explore the economy from the vantage point of people's concrete activities and aspirations. And what I'd like to do further is to bring in, for example, the relational proximity framework and say, but we need an even more relational perspective on the economy. And that means we have to understand that the economy is embedded within complex systems of relationships which allow for a much more holistic approach to problems such as inequality, poverty, and unemployment. And just as a more practical in terms of policies, so we have to move away from this excessive focus on growth to a well-being economy. We have to start leveling the playing field in an economy designed to support corporate conglomerates. We need less monopolies and more local producers. We have to prioritize and build networks, especially of smaller and medium businesses, but also acknowledge and encourage and support the informal economy. Also because in cities especially, the informal economy in Africa is very, very important. We need fewer shopping malls and more markets. We need more social entrepreneurs and fewer CEOs. We need to encourage, for example, more family and environmentally friendlier businesses. and also an education system that is more collaborative and more about teamwork. And we especially need more involvement of communities and families in, for example, service delivery, to create more opportunities on local levels, decentralization, and encouraging democracy, where people participate on many different levels and not just through voting every few years. Because in reality, markets, the states, and growth policies sometimes tend to drive us further away from what we do every day that makes us more relational and promotes the well-being of people. Which is why we should take the tools that we have, such as the relational proximity framework, and allow people to voice their concern, but also allow people to find the solutions to the problems they face every day. And this is obviously also very grassroots, but I think very necessary.